Hello and welcome to the 2026 MIFF Schools program. I'm Josh Nelson, and on behalf of all of the team at MIFF, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live, learn and work, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and indeed to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. At MIFF, we continue to celebrate the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. As those of you familiar with the MIFF Schools program from previous years will no doubt already be aware, these presentations have been created as an educational resource for teachers and students, providing an overview of each film text, suggesting strategies for analysis and topics for classroom discussion, and tying together aspects from the films to the various assessment criteria found within the language courses offered under VCAR, and also to subjects such as English, EAL, literature, media studies, and the film study course for the International Baccalaureate. In each of those, there's a focus on developing students' visual literacy skills and encouraging students to really critically engage with media across a range of contexts. And this obviously becomes a really key component of assessment as students progress into their final years of the VCE. So, for that reason, film analysis will be a key focus of these presentations, not as a replacement or as a substitute for that focus on language and cultural aspects, but rather as something that can sit side by side those elements within that post-screening classroom context. So while this year's MIFF Schools program is perhaps ideally suited to students within French, Spanish, Japanese, Mandarin, Greek, German, and English language courses, the selected films in this year's program offer opportunities for study and classroom analysis across a really diverse range of subjects, abilities, and age groups, preparing students for text-based assessments and really, as I said, developing those visual literacy skills. I'll focus on the film techniques and terminology that students would ideally have some kind of familiarity with going into the screenings in just a moment. But before I get to that, perhaps a brief synopsis of the film might be useful here. And I should also mention that this will be a relatively spoiler-free presentation. I'm going to avoid as much as possible giving away any crucial plot details or revelations, while obviously still providing you with a decent overview of the content of the film and, like I said earlier, strategies and suggestions for analysis or talking points that should really help structure that classroom discussion. Chimney Town Frozen in Time is a Japanese language animated fantasy/adventure film and a sequel to the hugely successful anime Poopelle of Chimney Town that released in 2020. The film follows the pint-sized Lubichi, who, struggling with the disappearance of his magical garbage friend Poopelle from the original film, finds himself accidentally transported to a mystical world of talking animals and mythical creatures, among them a large cat named Fluff, and together this unlikely duo are quested with restarting a giant clock that looms over the land, which has mysteriously frozen at 11:59, in order for Lubichi to find his way back home. Adapted for the screen by Akihiro Nishino, whose children's book inspired the original film, which he also wrote, and directed by Yusuke Hirota, Chimney Town Frozen in Time is a visually striking coming-of-age tale for viewers young and old, very much reminiscent of the work of a director like Hayao Miyazaki, with his films such as Spirited Away. Now, before I look at the film in more detail, I do want to return here to the terminology and techniques that I flagged at the beginning, and that core focus on developing students' visual literacy skills. So I would really recommend to teachers that prior to attending the screening, it would be really useful to either introduce or at the very least revise a selection of key film terminology and techniques that students should be thinking about while they're watching the film. Because, and I know I say this every year, it's crucially important to reinforce to students the need for them to actively engage with these films. Yes, they're entertaining. Yes, films are fun, but there should be that expectation that they'll be analysing these films as well. Whether that's as part of a non-English language course, or whether it's English, EAL, media, or a film studies unit. I'll talk about some of these elements in relation to the specific film in just a moment, but just as a general overview of film techniques, this would really be beneficial prior to the screening. And look, there's no shortage of film resources online that can certainly assist in that, whether that's in places like YouTube or in textbook form. I would also emphasize right from the outset that it's crucially important that students can firstly identify the technique. That secondly, they have an understanding of its general function in the context of filmmaking, the language of cinema, in creating meaning within the film itself. And then thirdly, that they can apply that understanding in order to analyze its use within the context of a scene, a sequence, a shot, or the film as a whole, in terms of how that particular technique shapes our understanding, say, of characters, or our understanding of themes, or the meanings that are produced within the film more broadly. And it's difficult, nigh on impossible, to achieve that final outcome unless those first two learning aims have been properly established and understood. And so, with that in mind, here are some of the basic techniques and terminology that students should ideally be familiar with. Cinematography. So being able to identify, for example, the use of a close-up or a wide-angle shot, or camera movement, panning, zooming, a high-angle or a low-angle shot. The various components of mise-en-scène, which incorporates things like props, costumes, the use of lighting, blocking, the composition of the frame. Where relevant, both music and lyrics, sound, dialogue, or for example voiceover, editing and the use of certain editing techniques, cross-cutting, continuity editing, rapid editing, the use of a single long take, for example. Also thinking about narrative structure and story element. How is the narrative put together? Is it chronological? Does it rely on things like flashbacks, for example? And lastly, what are the visual motifs or the use of symbolism within the particular film? And how does that accentuate our understanding of character or themes and so on? So as I mentioned, an awareness of these basic building blocks of the language of cinema are really essential, I think, pre-screening. And by setting these up prior to attending the screening, you're giving the students something to be on the lookout for while they're watching the film, rather than trying to work backwards after the screening, at which point that horse has already bolted. So depending on the age group and academic level of the students, you could always assign individual students or groups of students to look at a particular technique or a certain element of the film, so they're not necessarily overwhelmed in attempting to look for everything all at once. And this is where I would really encourage note-taking. And I should say note-taking with a pen and paper, and absolutely under no circumstances with phones, so that the students can remember certain details later in that classroom discussion. Because if their memory's anything like mine, it's too late again after that screening to remember the kind of key details that I think are really important for film analysis. And obviously, presentations like this will help perhaps jog some of those memories. Okay, so just to give you an overview of some of the key themes that are explored within Chimney Town Frozen in Time. We have the theme of grief, coping with grief and loss, the theme of coming of age, of time and waiting. And you'll notice that some of these are very much interconnected: being and mortality, romance, community and friendship, ideas of empathy, the concept of tsukumogami, which I will come back to later on within the presentation, notions of facing fears, moving on from the past, and the natural world is another theme that this film explores later on within the narrative. And I'll touch on these to varying degrees throughout the presentation. However, when approaching a film text with a classroom, I often like to start from the big picture and then gradually work into that more detailed, focused, scenic analysis. And there are a number of contexts that you could approach this film text through, either prior to the screening or certainly in that post-screening discussion and analysis context. Now, one way would be to look at this text in relation to its predecessor, or indeed through ideas of adaptation. As I mentioned in the synopsis, Chimney Town Frozen in Time is a sequel to Poupelle of Chimney Town, which began its life as a children's book written by Akihiro Nishino, which was then adapted for the screen and has since then taken on new lives in the forms of a play, a ballet, a musical. I believe it's been adapted into kabuki. But something I think is important to point out here, while I would certainly encourage everyone to see Poupelle of Chimney Town because it's a great film in its own right, this sequel is largely an independent tale. So by no means is it a requirement that you've seen the earlier film in order to understand or appreciate this film. It's like saying, do you need to have seen Raiders of the Lost Ark to appreciate Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom? Not really. They're largely independent tales revolving around the same key character. And the key information from that earlier film that carries forward into Frozen in Time is established from the beginning through flashbacks and actions that are explained over the course of the film. So you certainly won't be at a loss to understand this film if you've not seen the earlier work. The earlier work is also quite different stylistically and from a genre perspective. The earlier film is very much a sort of dystopian science fiction steampunk set within Chimney Town, revolving around these key figures of Lubitsch and Poupelle. So in terms of context, if audiences have seen it, there's obviously scope for sort of comparative analysis, but I would focus on ideas of adaptation. And I've provided some resources and suggestions for further reading that would assist in that classroom context. So the Wikipedia link, the Japanese Wikipedia link for Chimney Town, goes into great detail on not just the film's production, but also the adaptation history. I've also provided a link there to the original book. The author, Nishino, has uploaded images and text from the work, and accompanied by quite a lovely note where he talks about not all children either have access or the means to purchase this children's book. And he describes his desire that he would prefer an audience for the book rather than financial remuneration. Obviously, buy the book if you can, as always, but that would certainly be an avenue to incorporate into a wider classroom contextual discussion through the original tale that's online. I've also provided links to the official film website. It's in both Japanese and English, so easily translatable. Also from a cultural context, the film as a work of anime. What are the kinds of cultural significance or cultural importance of anime within Japan more broadly? Another important context that I'll be drawing on throughout this presentation, and that I would absolutely encourage you to draw upon in classroom analysis, would be to look at the film's production background. So through figures like the director, Yusuke Hirota, and other figures involved with the production like Nishino-san. And I've provided links there to both the press kit of the film, which is located on the Best Friend Forever website, and also interviews with Hirota-san from the Asian Movie Pulse website as well. And as Hirota explains in one of those interviews, providing a little bit of context here, or a window into his creative intentions for the film. In the previous film, we explored the theme of believing. This new chapter continues that universal theme, taking it even further by delving into the act of waiting, a powerful form of belief in itself. Through this work, I wanted to portray the strength and kindness of caring deeply for others, and the honest heart we must hold on to. Quotes like that, I think, are really useful within that classroom analysis to encourage students to consider how those kinds of sentiments or those aims or intentions translated to the screen. Another important context through which you could analyze and discuss this film would be through issues of form and style. So as animation. So again, this could follow on from the kind of cultural context of anime within Japanese culture more broadly. So Chimney Town employs a largely hybrid 2D, 3D style of animation. And here I think students should consider the following kinds of questions. What are some reasons that a filmmaker might opt for animation rather than live action to tell a particular story? Or what kinds of responses or associations, so for example, fantasy, childhood, cultural, does this particular style of animation within Chimneytown evoke? How does this animated feature contrast with other styles of animation? And here you could draw on the kind of identifiable characteristics of, say, classical Disney style, or Pixar, or the Aardman studio in the UK, or even a comparative studio within Japan itself, Studio Ghibli, which I mentioned earlier in respect to the similarities perhaps between Hayao Miyazaki and this film. Again, each of those studios, I would argue, has very distinct, identifiable style, and beyond that, ideological and thematic concerns, preoccupations that define their approach and their subject matter. Where does this film sit perhaps in contrast or in similarity to those various other studios? And lastly, encouraging students to isolate key examples from the text. Again, a really crucial element of analysis. Students being encouraged to justify their analysis by pointing to particular examples from the work. What sequences in the film stood out for the particular ways that they utilized the various possibilities intrinsic to an animated form of storytelling? And again, referring back to the production background and figures like Hirota-san, who explains, "Visually, we've aimed to create a warm and artistic fantasy world. The animation combines Japan's unique animation techniques with expressive 3D CG character movement and a hybrid of 2D and 3D background art. It was always important to me not to destroy the visual look of that world through CG elements and technology. Very often the CG element can disrupt the animation in one way or another. Even though the animation is created using that technology, I made sure it wouldn't become a distraction or create visual noise for the audience, so I paid close attention to that balance. CGI can often make people look sterile, and I wanted to achieve the effect of hand-drawn animation in terms of movement and character design." An ideal prompt to have students consider where in the film they saw that, or indeed the issues he raises about the ways that technology can shape an audience's connection to the characters within the film. And maybe you could apply that as a prompt to look back at studios like Disney, Pixar, Aardman, or even Ghibli again. So as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, film techniques are a really crucial element of film analysis, and the importance of students being able to A, identify the technique, B, having an understanding of its general function within the context of filmmaking and producing meaning within a film, and C, being able to apply those understandings or that knowledge to an analysis of a particular scene, sequence, or the film as a whole. So how does this particular filmmaker and this film use those various techniques in certain ways, in traditional or non-traditional ways, conventional or unconventional? So some basic techniques that are on show within the film. The use of the close-up. Well, why would a filmmaker use a close-up? To emphasize a key identification or empathy with the character on screen, like we see here in terms of the wide-eyed figure of Lubici. By contrast, a wide angle situates the audience in a very different relationship to the subjects on screen. And here we have Lubici and Fluff walking through a kind of market early on within the film. If sort of Lubici in particular is sort of the fish out of water. How does that change our relationship or our understanding of his character in that context of the setting? So wide angle provides a greater window onto the world, but one that also has thematic associations as well, in a sense of him being an outsider or a stranger, which we wouldn't have that same relationship if that sequence had been filmed primarily through close-ups. Also, the position of the camera angle in relation to the subjects really does shape or influence how we understand characters on screen. And here we have a use of a high angle shot of the camera looking down at Lubici and Pupel. Well, when high angles are often used, talking about a technique's general function, it often tends to diminish the character on screen. But this particular example is a little bit more nuanced, because while the high angle shot might have that effect to a degree, emphasizing perhaps Lubici's sense of isolation or loss through this sort of ghostly figure of Pupel, the tension within the frame itself, of them being elevated above the rest of Chimney World, creates tensions in terms of their status within the world, in the fact that Lubicci can be both disempowered and elevated at the same time. And there's a recurrent sort of motif within the dialogue or themes of this film in terms of the power of looking up or don't look down. And I think shots like that, because of the use of the high angle and the tension with the background, emphasizes that thematic tension between aspirations and giving up. And with the use of the low angle in this particular instance, we have a more conventional approach to technique, where when the camera is beneath the subject or character looking up, it tends to elevate the status or power of that particular character, like we have here with this image of one of the rat guards. The low angle shot emphasizes this creature as an imposing figure within the narrative. So again, that key takeaway is impressing upon students the importance of contextual analysis. And you can't really have that unless students have those learning aims of identifying the technique and understanding its basic function, and then being able to adapt that to the particular film text in question. Some other techniques that we see on show throughout the film that I would draw students' attention to: the use of lighting. How does lighting shape our emotional connection to characters or setting? And colour, in this particular instance, like the cold blue light, frames this castle in a very particular way. Music is another key one within the film. The character of Nagi is a singer. She performs at a club in one key sequence, and we hear a number of songs within the film. So encouraging students to think about how music shapes the dramatic content or emotional content of certain scenes, but how do lyrics accentuate or develop our awareness of character and themes as well. And lastly, compositions. How does the framing of certain characters develop our understanding of them or the film's themes more broadly? Or indeed, the relationship between characters within particular compositions, like we see there on the bottom right, with the tension between Fluff and Lubicci, as Fluff is saying, "But I'm disappointed." Well, how is the dialogue reflected in the composition? This spatial distance between the two of them emphasizes that emotional disconnect, that sense of disappointment that Fluff is voicing at this particular moment in time. So again, these are all considerations that students should be encouraged to be on the lookout from the get-go prior to the screening. One of the other key concepts that I mentioned earlier in respect to film techniques is the concept of mise-en-scène. And mise-en-scène essentially refers to all the various components that go into a film's visual design, from lighting, composition, the use of props, the blocking of characters or actors within the frame, the use of color, the use of costumes, and so on and so on. So how do all of those various elements work together to convey aspects related to themes or character? What can we tell about characters, their emotional state, or the worlds that they inhabit solely from the look of certain scenes or sequences? And you'll notice just from these images here, the diversity within the film's mise-en-scène. That image on the upper left is of Lubicci in Chimney Town at the beginning of the film, and then contrast the color palette and the design within that frame to the other images from the land that he's transported to. The use of color, these vivid reds, greens, purples, I think they each convey very distinct and different emotional reactions within the audience. The kind of design within those creations as well stands in stark contrast to the earlier mise-en-scène that's established of Chimney Town and this idea of Lubicci's home. So these are all things for students to consider. Chimney Town frozen in time is also ideal from the perspective of a character study, and there are a number of characters that we see within the narrative. And here I think students could be encouraged to consider each of these in relation to the film's key themes and ideas, and perhaps what they represent or personify. These ideas of waiting or self-belief or grief or loss. What character flaws or strengths do each of these characters reveal or demonstrate? And in what ways perhaps do the characters change over the course of the film? So some essential characters to consider here. Obviously, the key figure of Lubicci and his partner in crime, Fluff. We also have the pairing of Gus and Nagi, who provide one of the film's sort of romantic subplots. The figure of Pupel, again, a figure carried over from the original film, and Lubitsch's former friend who's constructed out of garbage. Again, it connects him to these themes or ideas of loss. We have the character of the Rat Queen. We have a bunch of orphans that Nagy has taken up with, and a pair of inventors as well. And each of these plays key roles within the journey of Lubitsch and Fluff, as well as the lives of Gus and Nagy as well. So again, there's lots of scope here to look at character in more detail and how they're presented within the film, and more importantly, in connection to some of the film's key themes. Themes such as time and waiting, which are really central to this film. So students should ideally consider how these themes apply in different ways to those individual characters, as well as to the film as a whole. And here I would ask students to consider, can waiting be a response to grief and loss that is destructive? So, for example, the inability to move on with your own life, as well as being an act of bravery, as this quote that I've cited here from Nishino implies. Or how is the idea of believing connected to the theme of waiting? And we have this at various points within the narrative. So, for example, there's a sequence involving the Rat Queen, where she says, "It's embarrassing that all sense of time is lost in this fortress of time." Well, what's the impact on her or the other characters of this timelessness, the absence of time? Contrast that perhaps with the character of Lubitsch and this sentiment, waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. Once again, drawing on the insight of figures like Nishino-san are ideal prompts for discussion. Like he says here, "The story behind the film is rooted in something I experienced in my 20s, a time when a close friend of mine disappeared and all I could do was wait, not knowing if he would ever return. And so I made the decision to wait. Even now I believe it was the most courageous choice I've ever made. When you act on your own, it's your own will. But to wait for someone else, especially when the odds are high that they may never return, that takes a different kind of bravery. And it was that feeling I poured into this story. This is the story of a boy who once gave up on believing, but he must face the choice again, to believe and wait. Will the clock, once stopped, ever begin to move again? It's not just the story of someone special. It's the story of anyone who's ever stood still, yet refused to give up." So the motif of clocks is obviously central to Chimney Town. And here I think students should consider the ways in which the symbolism of clocks is employed throughout the film. So not just in terms of the visual design, the mise-en-scène, but also in connection to these key themes: waiting, grief, loneliness, being and mortality, friendship, and the promise or the hope in reunions. And I think students might also consider how the film explores contrasting notions of time as both objective and subjective in respect to the film's narrative structure and also its interweaving subplots. So prompting students to consider, in a very general sort of philosophical sense perhaps, these ideas surrounding time as something that can be marked objectively, seconds, minutes, hours, and so on, but also how our experience of time works or functions subjectively, the way time can seem to speed up or slow down, which is certainly the case when dealing with grief or loss or trauma, the notion of the world grinding to a halt. And I think this film is an ideal text to really delve deep into these contrasting understandings of time. And the film also opens with this wonderful little voiceover, an analogy that I'd not heard or thought of before, where we hear Lubitsch say, "A clock has two hands. The two hands move at different speeds, so they repeat their hellos and goodbyes. The two hands first overlap at 1:05. As soon as they overlap, they separate and overlap again at 2:10. They basically overlap once an hour, but they never do during the 11th hour. No matter how much they run, they're always alone. The 12 o'clock bell celebrates the reunion. Before the bell rings, there's always the 11th hour of being alone." So how does that framing device of the voiceover inform our understanding of what takes place within the film in terms of these thematic elements of empathy, connection, reunions, and waiting, amongst other ideas? As I've alluded to already, the themes within the film are deeply connected. But you could, again, focus in on ideas of grief and loss. So, prompting students to consider, what are some of the consequences of grief that are explored within the film? How is that reflected in aspects such as the film's visual style? And as I alluded to in that previous slide, also the narrative structure. So the use of, say, flashbacks, where the past intrudes upon the present at a structural level and a thematic or philosophical level, or the use of parallel plots within the film, time moving at different paces within the one narrative. In what ways are grief and loss connected to these other themes of waiting and belief? Referring back to that earlier quote by Nishino, or to the recurring motifs of clocks. And again, thinking about composition, mise-en-scène, visual design. How are these themes represented visually? The theme of empathy also plays a key role within the film's plot and its characters. And I think there is certainly scope here to extend that to an analysis of Japanese cultural customs and traditions. So in what ways does the film's focus on empathy distinguish it from other films within similar genres, such as from the US, which tend to rely more on clear-cut struggles between good and evil? Again, this is something you could link back to that earlier slide in terms of the differences between various animation studios. Disney, Pixar, Studio Ghibli, perhaps. And something that prompted this for me was a review of the film that complained about the lack of a clear-cut villain. And while that's certainly not an issue for me, I thought that observation really reflected a kind of cultural difference between an American perspective, where there is that tendency to play out a kind of thematic struggle between clearly defined ideas of good and evil. I don't think this film fits neatly within those kinds of conventions, and I think students should really be encouraged to consider what that is. What is that saying about the world of characters within this film? That we're being encouraged perhaps to empathize with even antagonists within the film. For me, that's one of the absolute strengths of this film and this filmmaker. So how does the film explore empathy at a visual design level? Perhaps through the recurring motif of eyes, like we see here. The extreme close-ups on figures like Fluff and his eyes, or this creature in the upper right, or again, Lubitsch's eyes in that close-up moved to tears, or a character like Poopel, Were You Worried About Me? There's an ideal example of empathy on screen right there. Or drawing upon quotes from figures like Nishino-san. So I mentioned the theme or concept of Tsukumogami earlier in the presentation, and this very much is a recurrent one within Chimney Town. And it relates in some ways to characters' relationship to particular cherished objects, such as clocks, the idea of marking time, but also toys. So in what ways does the film explore our connection to these types of objects and the values we place upon them? And again, this would be ideal for development of a cultural concept or study. Students could be encouraged to explore the folkloric concept of Tsukumogami, or indeed ideas connected to tamashi, or the notion of a soul. And as it's explained within the film from the character of Gus, Tsukumogami is this notion that cherished objects contain a kind of soul, and that rather than throwing items away, we repair them to maintain that soul, to maintain our connection, our cherished connection with these objects. The way in which Tsukumogami is explored within the film immediately brings to mind other cultural concepts, such as kintsugi, this idea of piecing back broken items, such as vases or plates or bowls or whatever it might be, with, say, gold leaf. Cracks are still visible, but it's given a new lease on life. It maintains its beauty in a new form, as opposed to just throwing it away. There are also a number of other recurring motifs and themes on show throughout Chimney Town that students could explore and analyse in further detail. And I would ask students to consider how these various motifs, again, comment upon or develop the film's central themes, or further our understanding of character, or the relationships between characters. So some motifs like cycles, whether that's bicycle wheels, the mechanisms of a clock, the architecture of various structures within the film. These refer back in varying ways to these ideas of time and waiting, of history repeating itself, of folding back on itself. this tension between stasis and momentum. Or, as I mentioned earlier, these tensions between the theme of facing fears or flying. These are both recurring tropes within the film. And this tension we get at various points through lines of dialogue like "look up" or "don't look down." We also have a number of references throughout the film to Shinzo, or heart. So what does heart represent? Beyond, obviously, the kind of physical heart. Can we connect notions of Shinzo to Tamashi, or the soul? And again, themes of nature certainly emerge in the film's later stages. Again, you could look at this in isolation within the narrative or broaden it to wider cultural fascinations with nature through animation. And again, the films of Hayao Miyazaki would provide an ideal source of comparison, through films like Princess Mononoke. There's also lots of scope within this film to focus in an analysis or discussion of various cultural customs or concepts within the classroom to deepen students' understanding and appreciation of both the film and wider Japanese cultural traditions and customs. So, for example, a scene involving transport of Lubichi and Fluff, and we hear that very familiar voiceover, "Oreguchi wa hidarigawa desu." The doors on the left side will open. So, for anyone who's lived in places like Tokyo or visited Japan, these kinds of refrains will very much be familiar. So, one thing that's really great about this film is the way it takes identifiable elements of Japanese culture and then transports them into this mystical land. We also have references to festivals, the Festival of Time. So this could be used as a prompt to look at Matsuri festivals in more general. We have that ever-present cultural fascination with junkin, or paper, rock, scissors. There are particular sequences in the film where we see the figure of Gus perform a kind of ritual alongside water. So this would be an ideal sequence to look at in terms of other key rituals within everyday Japanese life. There's also a reference to the Surta at one point. Now, this is a form of mythology that I associated more with sort of Norse gods, the Surta being a sort of fire giant. So how does its inclusion shape our understanding of mythology and this fusion of mythologies, perhaps, or cultural texts and references? We also have references to Hanbo Jutsu or Jojutsu at one point, variations of martial arts and fighting techniques, emphasis on masks, not just in terms of Halloween, but again, this could be extended to the role of masks more broadly within Japanese culture, traditions such as No theatre. And there are also references at various points to food, and I couldn't pass up an opportunity to give a shout out to Japanese food. Certainly something to talk about, perhaps. So without giving anything away or too much away, the concluding imagery of the film. What impression does Hirota leave us with at the end of the film? What's the tone of the ending? In what ways is the director encouraging the audience to reflect upon the significance of Lubichi's journey, its impact upon him and the other characters that he's come into contact with along the way? And as always, students should really be encouraged to consider a range of interpretations in their responses. And as elsewhere, you could again draw on quotes from Hirota-san, where he provides this insight into his filmmaking, explaining, "At the very root of my approach to making films is my wish to see children enjoy watching it and to see them smile. That's the main motivation for me. As a creator of animations, I aspire to depict a better and brighter future. This is how I begin to ponder what kind of characters I want to shape in my imagination." Another ideal prompt. And lastly, thinking about how to apply all this knowledge in the form of an assessment task, students could be tasked with reading and critically engaging with other published reviews of the film and then respond by writing their own, either in Japanese or in English, drawing on that close analysis of the film and the issues raised within classroom discussion, and ideally utilizing the kinds of terminology that I've outlined throughout the presentation. And here's just an excerpt from one particular review of the film. I provided a link there to the Josh at the Movies website, no relation, where Joshua M. Hayes writes, "The impact of tackling grief was unexpected. strangely elevating Frozen in Time above the heights that its predecessor dared to approach. The animation is just as stunning as it was in Poopelle, this time allowing for far more character models and lush landscapes. If the previous movie felt a little Frosty the Snowman, this one leans more Pixar wondrous. The kind of attention to detail sets both Chimney Town entries apart from others in the best kind of way. Perhaps there could be future adventures that take place in this world. However, matching the emotional peaks that they were able to accomplish with the narrative parallels will be a difficult feat. Rare is a sequel that surpasses the original, and Chimney Town, Frozen in Time, manages that with a classy and time-specific approach. And I would encourage you to read that review, and indeed others of the film, in full. And with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. For information regarding bookings, age suitability, or additional details for all of the films in this year's MIFF Schools program, head on over to miff.com.au/schools, and you'll find all the information and resources at your disposal, as well as links to the rest of this year's festival program and screenings. And so, on behalf of myself, Josh Nelson, and senior programmer Kate Fitzpatrick, we'd like to thank you for watching this presentation and to wish you a very enjoyable and, as always, an educationally rewarding screening at this year's Melbourne International Film Festival. Thanks so much.